All right, let's see. Everyone's slowly coming in. Welcome everyone who's coming in. We're just going to give it a minute while all the participants start joining. All right. All right, it looks like most people are in now. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is our second of two special talks for the 50th anniversary of the Institute of Acoustics. We are very excited to be having these talks and to be celebrating the anniversary, and we thank Peter for being here with us. So today we will be hearing from Peter Tyack. He's going to be giving us a great talk to celebrate this anniversary. And he has said he's happy for questions throughout the talk. So if you want to go ahead and raise your hand during the talk or pop questions into the Q&A or the chat, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we will have some time at the end for questions as well. So I will hand it over from here and go ahead and take it away, Peter.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate the Institute's giving the invitation. And what I will be doing is I will be trying to mirror a little bit a talk on the history of sonar and be talking about the impacts of sonar on cetaceans. I just see the acoustics .ac sign here. I don't see my first screen. Does everybody else?
You're having sharing issues?
Yeah, I just saw the overall Institute screen, not my...
So it should be able to be taken over now if you press share screen down at the bottom.
To reshare?
There we go.
Okay.
You see your screen.
Full screen?
Yep.
That's great. So thanks again. I'll start by mentioning, again, as I mentioned, I'll try to give a little bit of a chronological description of this issue with the basic science. The first concerns raised about effects of noise on marine life in general were in the early 70s, where people were concerned about masking of communication. Roger Payne, a cetologist, and Doug Webb, an underwater acoustician, in 1972 suggested that shipping noise might limit the long-range communication of marine mammals, particularly the low-frequency calls of baleen whales. Art Meerberg, at the same time, summarized data on how anthropogenic sounds change the behavior of fish and mammals. And after extensive work on the hearing of fishes, Art Meerberg, by 1980, pointed out that the hearing of fishes is sensitive enough to detect signals, evolved to detect signals in the pre-industrial ocean quiet, that slight elevations of shipping noise might mask sounds and limit the range of communication in fish as well. Oh, I'm not forwarding. There we go. So when we talk about this issue of masking and the range of audibility of a signal, that involves some of the greatest ranges of potential effects. There's been a classic book on marine mammals and noise that looks at zones of noise influence I'm showing here, from the closest impacts of intense sound of injury and hearing loss to a little further away avoidance, even further behavioral disruption. And that range of audibility could occur whenever the sound level is above the ambient noise, accounting for the detection threshold. And I'd just like to walk through the explanation that Payne and Webb gave for the low frequency calls of fin and blue whales. I'll talk here about the calls of blue whales. They have durations of tens of seconds. You can see the units of a blue whale call in the lower right-hand spectrogram. They have a fundamental frequency, typically in 15 to 30 hertz, with very strong harmonics, and source levels on the order of 180 dB. And it varies with geographical region. There are at least 9 different versions of blue whale song globally. You probably are all familiar with the textbook image of average ambient deep ocean noise with movements of the Earth, geological sources having the biggest influence below about 10 hertz, shipping having a significant influence in the 10 to 100 hertz range, and then noise range as we go up in frequency and being dominated by wind speed until we get up to about 100 kilohertz. What I would like to point out here is that 15 to 30 hertz region for the fundamental frequencies of fin and blue whales not only is very low absorption as the sound passes through seawater, but it had very low noise in the pre-industrial ocean. So Payne and Webb argued that these whales evolved to select basically a low noise window in the spectrum of deep ocean ambient that now has been impacted by shipping noise. And their model in the 1970s using very simple sort of sonar equation modeling suggested that low frequency calls for blue and fin whales could be detected 1,000 kilometers away. And this is just a graphical description. They assumed a transition range of about 6.5 kilometers from spherical spreading to cylindrical spreading. And that suggested that the range of communication was about 1,000 kilometers in an ambient noise level of 74 dB. At this period, I was a biology undergraduate, and I have to say I found it very difficult to believe that these sounds could be detected at this range. And I was reminded of Henry David Thoreau, who raised a question when people in Boston were celebrating a telegraph being initiated from Texas. He said, "Why are people celebrating? What do people in Boston care about what anybody has to say in Texas?" And I wondered why whales would care about 1,000-kilometer ranges. But we as terrestrial biologists don't have the right intuition about how sound propagates. Doug Webb, as an underwater acoustician, knew at that point about, for example, some of the naval capabilities. And after the Berlin Wall fell, we whale biologists also were able to use this US Navy sound surveillance system in order to track whales. So here's an example of the system off North America. And here's an example of a long-range detection of a blue whale call. There was a blue whale with a distinctive call, and Chris Clark at Cornell University, working with Chuck Gagnon, one of the naval operators of SOSUS, used the system to track this whale for 43 days as it swam more than 1,700 kilometers from up around the DC latitude down to Miami and back again. And the track also taught me, well, maybe whales do care about 1,000-kilometer ranges. They move over relatively short time periods, over weeks, over this kind of range. They could easily move 100 kilometers a day. So again, as a human terrestrial biologist, I underestimated both the potential range of communication and the range over which these animals live. And as a reality check, here again is a spectrogram from Chris of this whale as it swam about 32 kilometers away from one hydrophone, and the recording of the same signals recorded at 1,040 kilometers. So this definitely was, Payne and McVeigh were correct. Payne and Webb were correct that these sounds could be detected at large ranges. And they were pointing out there's a set of limits to detecting a signal. There's the question of sensitivity of hearing. A sound can't be detected when it's so faint it cannot be heard. Meerberg's point was that at least fish we know some fish have sensitive enough hearing to be adapted for the pre-industrial ambient. And if the ambient noise is elevated, you're likely to get masking, where sound cannot be detected when the signal to noise ratio is less than the detection threshold. And I'll go back to our schematic here of increased noise reducing the effective range of communication. If we assume a source level of 180 dB at 1 meter, spherical spreading to 6.5 kilometers, and then cylindrical spreading after 6.5, in the 74 dB ambient, we have this range of 1,000 kilometers. If shipping noise elevated the ambient in the frequency range of these calls by 20 dB, in the cylindrical spreading domain, that would reduce the range of communication to tens of kilometers. So this was the first alert that any biologists had about the impact of noise on marine life, that whales, like large whales like fin and blue whales, whose numbers had been decimated by whaling, might have a significant impact on their capability of reproducing, because many of these calls are used by males to advertise during the breeding season, if the range of communication is reduced this much, and the density is so low because of whaling, maybe a female couldn't find a male for mating, and maybe this would impact reproduction. This was the first concern raised. But later research has shown that whales don't tolerate this range reduction, and they can compensate for anthropogenic noise. And there's data showing that they will increase their source level and increase noise. If the noise is band limited, they will shift the call frequency out of the noise band. And if the noise varies over time, they can increase the length of calls or increase the redundancy of calls to get the message through when the noise isn't as intense. I'll talk mainly here now just about this increasing of source level, which is called the Lombard effect in humans. It's common in humans, and almost all birds and mammals that have been tested show the Lombard effect. It's even been shown in frogs. So the basic result you get is you look on the upper right, as the environmental noise level increases, the animal, in this case a songbird, will sing more loudly. And if it is a one-to-one, what it's doing is if it can increase its source level by 1 dB for every dB of noise elevation, it can maintain the same effective range of communication with increasing noise, at least over a certain range of noise. Some animals do not have a one-to-one increase, so they don't completely compensate for noise, but almost all birds and mammals tested show some compensation for noise in this way. And this reduces our concern for whales. Testing for Lombard in whales is pretty difficult because it requires measuring the source level. It's often difficult to estimate the range to a submerged whale precisely, and the propagation of sound can be complicated. So the example I'll give uses an acoustic recording tag to measure a sound level directly on the whale. It's not exactly a far field on-axis level that you then correct for range, but at least here's an example of an acoustic recording tag roughly a meter away from the sound producing organ of a right whale. I'll play the sound of a typical up call of a right whale, which is used as a contact call for reunions for, say, mothers and calves to come together, or for a male joining a social group. And this is what it sounds like. I'm not sure if when I did the shared, the sound went through. Were you able to hear okay?
We heard you.
Okay, great. Susan Parks recorded data from a lot of contact calls of tagged right whales, and showed that if you look at the level for each individual whale has its own symbol. If you look at the noise level on the x-axis and the level received on the tag, so sort of a pseudo source level on the y-axis, you can see pretty much a one-to-one relationship, that as the noise level increased from about 100 dB to about 140 dB, mostly from shipping traffic, the level of the call produced by the whale on the y-axis increased to compensate. So at least for this situation where, say, a mom and calf are separated and mom needs to maintain contact with the calf, she won't accept the range reduction, but she will increase her source level in order to maintain the same effective range of communication with about a 40 dB variation in noise level. Shipping noise also is somewhat band limited. And so Susan also looked at the idea that as low frequency shipping noise elevates, maybe these calls, which are in the sort of 50 to 100 hertz region, may shift higher in frequency out of that noise band. And she analyzed data from the South Atlantic of upcalls recorded from right whales in the South Atlantic in the 70s and 2000 in the same habitat. And you can see on the left side here, the population basically went from being bases to being tenors. Similarly, from the North Atlantic, from the 50s to 2000. And this summarizes the data. The Southern Ocean habitat had lower ambient noise than the North Atlantic habitat. But in all cases over this time period, within each site, the start frequency of the calls increased, and the levels in the North Atlantic were higher than in the South Atlantic. I mentioned that Meerberg early on had summarized reactions of fish and marine mammals to noise. I'm now going to look at avoidance and behavioral disturbance, which is not as high in this model of zones of noise influence, doesn't involve a range as great as audibility, but is still relatively far out. And here's data from the 80s, early 80s, tracks of migrating gray whales migrating past a moored airgun at the center of the circles here. So these are isopleths of 170, 165, 160 dB. At the center of this is where the sound source was. And if you draw a line perpendicular to the motion of most of the whales and summarize the distance of the tracks from shore in control versus playback conditions. So the picture here I'm showing of the tracks is during exposure to the moored air gun. And you should see that there's a big gap in the center of the bullseye where the sound source was. And if you look at the distribution of the tracks on the right side, you can see on the top is the control distribution of the migration distance from the ship normally. And then on the bottom right, you see the playback. You can see the distribution is shifted offshore. And that's quite obvious in the figure on the left. By using the measurements of sound, how sound levels decreased as you moved away from the sound source, indicated by the isopleths on the left, you could also then look at the probability of avoidance, how many fewer tracks you got from these whales as a function of the average pulse pressure level of the air gun on the top. And for more continuous sounds, like a drilling platform played back from an underwater speaker, the received level, sound pressure level as a function, the amount of avoidance as a function of sound pressure level. The continuous noises in this experiment showed roughly 50% avoidance at a received level of about 120 decibels. This, in the 80s, was converted into basically etched in stone that at least the US regulators assumed an onset of behavioral disturbance or avoidance at a received level of 120 dB. And I will point out later that I think there are problems with using a single number as an onset, and certainly in extrapolating a number from one study in one context to other species in other contexts. Now I'll zoom in to the closest range of the most intense sources. What about injury during exposure to very loud sounds? This posed a quandary to marine mammal biologists because in the US, the Marine Mammal Protection Act means we can't harm our animals. So how might one study injury without harming them? I should point out that one of the assumptions of the studies of injury from sound are that animals are only affected by sounds they can hear. And this has led most people looking at the impact of man-made sounds to weight the sound exposure by auditory weighting functions. On the left are audiograms of an invertebrate, a lobster, fish, dolphins, and porpoises as a function of sound. And with the audiogram, this shows the most sensitive, the lowest level of sound an animal can hear. So they're sort of like U's, and the bottom of the U is the most sensitive area. You can see dolphins and porpoises are relatively sensitive in the 10 to 100 kilohertz region, down to a level of about 40 to 50 dB. On the right shows the inverted and somewhat flattened weighting functions that are currently used in the US for 3 different hearing groups: baleen whales, low frequency; most toothed whales and dolphins listed high frequency; and animals like porpoises, which have very high frequency echolocation signals. Now, how to study the point at which sound can injure an animal? The way that was adopted is what was used for humans as well, and that is to measure temporary shifts in threshold. So you expose an animal, you measure the threshold at which an animal just detects a sound, you expose the animal to a loud sound, and then measure the hearing again immediately afterwards to see if the threshold shifted. This requires a quick measurement of hearing threshold, and the easiest ones to use are auditory brainstem responses. So on the left, upper left, you see a photograph of a dolphin with a jaw phone on his lower jaw on the lower left that's presenting a sound. You have on the white suction cup a positive electrode on the animal, and then the black one is a little further away from the brain. What it's measuring is it's measuring the differential voltage across those two suction cups. So on the lower left, you see in magenta the sound exposure, and on the blue above the sound exposure, you can actually see an electrical following response. So many neurons are following this signal that you can actually follow the response electrically. And as you decrease the loudness of the signal, you see where this disappears and allows a rapid measurement of sensitivity to sound. So if we look on the left of this figure in the duration of seconds, 10 to the minus 2, so 10 to the minus 2 seconds, all the green dots are exposures that failed to cause a change of hearing threshold. And the red triangle shows the level at about 225 or so dB, at which this sound source, an explosion simulator or a water gun, was able to temporarily affect hearing. The hearing came back to normal immediately afterwards, so it wasn't dangerous for the animal. If you look at 1 second signals, the level is about 200 dB. The longer the exposure, the lower the level required. The blue line indicates an equal energy line. So what that suggests is use a sound exposure level, the accumulated energy of exposure over time. And when you're above the hearing threshold effect for long periods of time, that is that you're entering the danger zone, and below it, you're in the safe zone. And the US has established thresholds for hearing loss sound exposure levels weighted by the hearing functions I showed you. And here's an example of numbers that we have for low frequency, high frequency, very high frequency cetaceans. And these are currently used for in regulation for estimates of risk of injury. However, right about the time in the late 1990s, when these temporary threshold shift experiments were beginning to yield results and show us safe levels of exposure, nature sent us a signal of an unexpected lethal effect of sound. Alexandros Francis, a Greek biologist, in 1998, published a paper showing that there was a large number of beaked whales, a largish toothed whale, larger than dolphins, smaller than sperm whales. It was about 14 beaked whales stranded within a 1 to 2 day period during low frequency active sonar tests. These were conducted by what was called Sacklant Center at that time. And the head of Sacklant Center held a workshop to review the claim. And they showed a very strong link in this bay in Western Greece between the runs of the sonar. You can see the first run when the ship came in was from 0600 to about 0800. That's run number 9. So it's perpendicular to shore offshore. 10 was coming into the shore. And you can see the strandings occurred within hours and tens of kilometers of the shore. This was the first indication of a causal link between sonar exposure and what was then defined as an atypical stranding. So a dozen or more animals stranding across tens of kilometers within a few hours, but not like a normal mass stranding of pilot whales, where one group will come ashore at one time. And by 2005, we knew that these atypical strandings occurred with 2 species typically of beaked whales. They were reported to coincide with naval maneuvers off Greece, 7 cases off the Canary Islands, 2 off Italy, 1 in the Bahamas, and 1 in Madeira. All of these known cases involved ships with mid-frequency sonars. So this posed, nature was sending us a signal that we hadn't known to look for. It was only after Francis published the paper that people could look back and recognize the link between atypical strandings and sonar exposure. Beaked whales, at this point in particular, were a real problem. They were like an incognito group of whales. They were second most species and least known whale family. This is a group of whales in which a new species of a 5 to 7 meter mammal is discovered every decade. I mean, that shows the level of ignorance we had. And they're seldom sighted at sea. They only surface briefly for short periods of time after long dives. So many species are only known from strandings. This raised a question: how can we study this potential problem, especially the risk of stranding, in a way that's safe for the species? And my lab joined with several others to start a study of this by tagging beaked whales with acoustic recording tags to study natural baseline behavior and record the sound and movement of the whale. And on the left is a photograph of Mark Johnson, the design engineer of this tag, showing the whale's eye view of a tag, the suction cups with which it's attached. It's attached non-invasively and typically lasts for between half a day to a day. We did work at the Tyack range in the tongue of the ocean in the Bahamas. This was a useful place to study responses to sonar because there are a lot of sonar exercises there. And it also has an extensive hydrophone array for real-time passive acoustic monitoring for beaked whales. We found that with our tags that beaked whales echolocation clicks have most of their energy between the 20 to 40 kilohertz region. Before these people had been listening on this range below 20 kilohertz, they didn't hear much. When the M3R program run by David Moretti at Newark adapted the analysis methods for their hydrophone array, they developed a system where each hydrophone could be, in this case, marked by a number. And when it detected beaked whale clicks, it would go red. And you could click on the red and look at a sort of pseudo spectrogram of what you were seeing. This is a perfect example of beaked whale clicks. The energy frequency range between about 24 to 45 kilohertz. There's a couple clicks a second. In order to confirm this was beaked whales, when the clicks stopped and the animal was heading up to the surface, we worked with the Bahamas Marine Mammal Research Organization, and in calm seas, they identified Blainville's beaked whale coming to the surface. So this provided a way in real time for us to track where whales were doing echolocation dives, foraging dives by echolocation on the range. One of the puzzles of this was we discovered the echolocation band, as I mentioned, is sort of 20 to 45 or so kilohertz. The hearing of stranded animals has also been measured, and it's not very sensitive in the frequency range of the mid-frequency sonar. It ranges between 115 to 130 or so dB, the faintest signal that the whales could hear. So a normal environmental assessment would have said, oh, these are high-frequency specialists. They're almost certainly unaffected by mid-frequency sonar because they don't use clicks in those frequencies and their hearing is not very sensitive in those frequencies, but nature sent us a signal anyway. So to study the responses of tagged beaked whales to exposure to sonar and also to predator sounds, we tagged beaked whales on the Tyack range. Here's an example of attaching a tag to a beaked whale. It looks easy in this picture, but you can only tag a whale about once every week because they surface so seldom. You need to get a small boat nearby, and you can only do it in very calm weather. And here's an example of a dive profile of a beaked whale to whom we did 2 playbacks on the dives. The first dive is a pre-exposure dive to about 1 kilometer. The animal then comes to the surface and does quiet dives. We call them recovery dives. We consider them shallow, even though there's one that goes to 500 meters. After it's recovered, it does the second deep foraging dive and starts echolocating. So we know that from the range where the animal is and what it's doing. And we then use have a ship on the range with a playback setup, and we do a dose escalation. And the red asterisks on the second dive show the increases in received level of the sonar pings as recorded on the animal. And then after that, the third dive, we did a playback of killer whale. And there was a long interdive interval after the killer whale playback, and then 2 more normal dives afterwards. This is what we hear on the tag after retrieving it from a sonar playback. You'll first hear echolocation click, search, buzz. It's an attempt to capture prey. There's the sonar. There's a short pause, but the animal then starts search clicks, does another buzz to capture prey. So we would call this not a silencing response, but at some received level, the animal would stop foraging. And if you look at the dive pattern, most of the pre-exposure dives, the animal is working a layer at about 1 kilometer. On the upper left, you can see, for example, it works that layer for a long time period. And the dark blue of the overlaid on the dive shows the period in which it's doing echolocation clicks, search clicks, and buzzes. On the middle left, you see the dose escalation in red asterisks of the sonar pings. And you can see that that this dive stopped prematurely. The animal went up to about 600 meters and stopped and did a long and slow ascent. For the killer whale playback on the bottom left, the animal stopped even earlier and waited even longer at about 500 meters. We think what this is doing is that for these animals, we call them deep divers, but actually in the deep is their safe spot. Their predators live in the top 20 meters of water typically. So surfacing is dangerous. And we think the animals are pausing at 500 meters to sort of, having heard a threat at the surface, to come up with sort of an anti-threat response. And they will take a long time surfacing. They actually randomize their azimuth on surfacing there too. So if they were heard while they were echolocating at the bottom, after they silence, they move far away in order for a potential detection deep, not to put them at risk at the surface. And even our goal for these studies was to intentionally expose as few animals as possible to detect a statistically significant response, and then use that for monitoring responses to more realistic exposures. So the experiments demonstrate that the sound causes the response, and then monitoring can look at the situation in more realistic settings. So you see the ascent rate is very low, below the typical one. The number of buzzes used for foraging is very low. The whole click duration, the time period that they're using echolocation to forage, is low, and the ascent duration is much longer than the baseline dives. So having sort of learned this, we also then started to want to understand responses to actual naval sonar exercises. And this plot shows the track of an animal that was tagged on the range well before the exercise. But in the 3 days before the exercise, the animal actually moved to about 30 kilometers away from the range. So once the ships had arrived but not transmitted, it already moved off range a little bit. During a 3-day exercise, the animals moved to about 70 kilometers off range. In the 3 days after the exercise, they moved back. And then in 3 to 6 days afterwards, they were back to normal foraging in their normal habitat on the range. So the satellite tag was super helpful with a long-range view of movement patterns of an animal. And the acoustic monitoring on the range also shows changes. So if you look at where the groups of beaked whales were detected clicking during dives, you look at the average number of these vocal periods, or a group of beaked whales using echolocation to dive. It was sort of 4 or so per hour before sonar in this case. You can see during a sonar exercise, it declined to almost 0. And then it took about 3 or so plus days to come back again. And the color plots on the bottom show, again, not that high a level just before sonar, almost no clicking on range during the sonar, and well after the sonar, quite an elevated rate of foraging, even above what you had pre-sonar activity. Here's another plot in which the circles on the red circles show hydrophones detecting a beaked whale dive in the 20 hours before an exercise. And in the middle, you see a gap during the exercise, which is slowly filled in on the right. That gap of no whales foraging is about 10 kilometers within the scope where the exercise occurred. And for a very rough idea of a received level, if you assume a 235 dB source level for the sonar, the 10-kilometer range, assuming spherical spreading, gives you a rough idea of about 155 dB. Dave Moretti's group at Newark analyzed for each hydrophone what was the probability of a beaked whale on that range starting to forage or not starting to forage as a function of the RMS received level of the sonar pings. So that on the model is on the left. On the right, you can see the probability of an animal starting a dive as a function of received level. And they were able to convert this into a risk function. What's the probability of disturbance, of disrupting a foraging dive as a function of received level? And here you can see about 50% of the animals responded about 150 dB, or around that area that I highlighted from that photograph, from the map. And the number that we can estimate most precisely is 50%. But you notice there are quite a few animals still responding at lower received levels. Here's an example of a particularly clear example of how you can link exposure and response of a goose-beaked whale. This is Zivius cavarostris, tagged on the Southern California range in 2010. Having worked at Tyack, we then expanded to work in Southern California, doing similar experiments. So on the upper right, you can see the dive profile of a Cuvier's beaked whale. You can see the dose escalation in red. And you can see that there's a point at which the whale stopped clicking, and there's a burst of speed of up to 6.5 meters per second as the animal dives down, again, closer to safety. That occurred, the cessation of clicking and the burst of speed occurred at a received level of about 100 decibels. So it's quite a strong response at a remarkably low received level. And I'd also like to note that from the point where that whale stopped clicking, at that point it was 4 kilometers away from the source. It didn't surface until it was 12 kilometers away from the source before surfacing with an azimuth that was sort of random. So this is the kind of move that it has to avoid detection in case a predator heard it clicking at depth. And if you look at the minimum received levels for beaked whale responses during the limited number of causal experiments where we intentionally exposed animals, you can see that there's a range of levels. There's a cluster around 127 to 140 dB, but there's also a cluster at around 100 dB, quite a bit lower level of response. We think this is likely to be quite a strong response at the point at which the whale detects sonar. Maybe this has something to do with an individual's prior exposure, maybe its personality, but there's absolutely clearly population variation within beaked whale populations in the dose at which they show a strong response. And this led the US Navy to develop a biphasic response function. People often unthinkingly will fit a logistic curve to data, assuming that the population has roughly normal distribution in its responsiveness. As I showed you in the last slide, we have data suggesting that there is a particularly sensitive subset of the population, and that leads to this shoulder on the left side of the dose response function. So this is a dose of sonar exposure, sound pressure level against probability of a response during a foraging dive. If we look at that level of a response at even 120 dB and assume a 220 dB source level for the sonar, that gives a transmission loss of about 100 dB. If we're at 20 log range, that suggests a range of 100 kilometers. Now, I showed the migrating gray whales that showed disturbance responses typically on the order of 1 kilometer. Is this realistic to expect disturbance responses over such a great range? Here's data from a lovely extensive set of satellite tagging work in the SoCal range, looking at dive responses of geolocated beaked whales during sonar exercises. And the y-axis here is the inter-deep dive interval duration. I showed you after our sonar and killer whale playback, there was a very long time period before the whale did another foraging dive. They found this was significantly longer for Cuvier's beaked whale in Southern California, out to a distance of 100 kilometers away from the nearest high-power mid-frequency sonar during exercises. So it clearly, the tagging studies we have are sensitive enough to detect responses over these kinds of large ranges. And my talk is primarily on sonar, but I wanted to give a UK relevant example here for other sources of sound. And there have been very detailed studies using passive acoustic monitoring, also looking at echolocation clicks used for foraging, to look at the number of hours in which you detect porpoises making echolocation clicks as a function of distance on the y-axis and hours relative to piling. And this data shows from the first 7 offshore wind farms in Germany that out to a distance of about 30 kilometers, you get a significant pattern of harbor porpoise ceasing to decreasing the amount of echolocation. And it actually, like with the beaked whales, it starts before the piling starts. They must be able to detect somehow the preparation for the onset of an industrial activity and already are modifying their behavior. before we think it has actually started. So to summarize, the way navies typically will do a risk assessment for sonar pre-operation, they want to assess the vulnerability in general, which means relating the distribution of the hazard, deciding where you're going to locate your sonar exercise as a function of how animal density changes with space and time. And this is particularly important for beaked whales because of their heightened sensitivity at great ranges. You can then use propagation modeling once you've decided where your exercise is likely to be in order to work out what the exposure profile would be for the population that you're concerned about. It's critical to use the dose response function in order to estimate this. And you use that to predict the impact. If the impact predicted is too high, you can iterate changing the location or the timing of the exercise to reduce impact. This is sort of the typical plan for pre-operational risk assessment. And I just want to point out again, most regulators that I'm aware of use a single threshold, like I mentioned, the 120 dB for continuous sources. Below that, no animals are affected. Above that, all animals are affected. That's what regulators typically use. So you set a threshold at the received sound level where the probability of response is 50%. And then you assume, well, let me just point out here with the red lines. You've got the 50% response on the dose response curve. That's your roughly 140 dB. So you would say that for the killer whales responding to this sonar, the threshold is 140 dB. You then can translate received level. If you want to look at the impact of this, you can translate received level into range just using source level and a propagation model. So using the propagation model shown on the right, 50% response at 140 dB would occur at about 2.7 kilometers. I just want to point out, 10% would respond at 52 kilometers. So even though you have many fewer animals responding out of that large range, the area indicated on the right side by the dashed blue line is so much bigger that it's going to actually accumulate a larger number than the 50% at 2.7 kilometers. Now, the way the regulators usually translate the range into an expected number of takes of animals impacted, in this example, I'm just assuming a uniform animal density of 1 kilometer squared. Usually the regulator has its own density map. And so they assume all animals within the 50% threshold range of 2.7 kilometers will respond. So they say, okay, if half of the animals respond out to this range, if we take all of them, that's the number we expect will be taken. That's what they assume. And in this case, that would be about 23 animals. However, if you use the actual dose response function and calculate the number of animals affected throughout the range, so in this case, the black dots on the right are animals that don't respond, and the red dots are animals that do respond. If you tally up all the animals that responded based on the full dose response function, the correct number is 6,437. This is not a small difference from the previous estimate of 23. It's off by 2 orders of magnitude. And the reason is even though the probability of response out at long range, it's not 0, and there's such a big area that you accumulate many more animals. This is particularly important for animals like beaked whales, where you have this a reasonable number of quite sensitive animals out at large ranges. And I'll give a couple examples, having argued for the importance of dose response functions, to show that the statistical methods have been developed that are remarkably good at developing probabilistic dose response functions as a function of exposure to sound. So here's an example of 8 dose escalation experiments to killer whales. The dark blue lines indicate the levels of dose escalation, and the numbers, if the number is in bright red, that indicates the level at which an animal responded. And if the number is in green, that's the highest exposure level achieved, but the animal didn't respond at all. So this data set with current methods can yield a probabilistic dose response function relating sound pressure level to onset of avoidance. And this is the critical function that we need to be able to predict the response of animals to sound. Again, because these dose response functions can be calculated with relatively low sample sizes, you can also split them by species, by behavioral context. This is a slightly different format in which we're looking at the probability of response as a function of cumulative sound exposure level throughout an exposure for a population of animals. And on the left side, you can see that when killer whales are feeding, the dashed blue line goes up to a high probability of response quite early at about 100 dB. On the right side, for non-feeding, you can see the killer whale is very similar to the sperm whale without much disturbance, much response, a change of behavior until you get to a much higher exposure level. And these kinds of data sets are really important for identifying particular contexts. In this case, you might want to work with animals in a non-feeding context or have exposure planned in a non-feeding context rather than feeding. It's also possible to run these experiments with multiple species and look for differences between species. The green line here shows the earlier exposure line used for beaked whales by the US Navy in 2012. The left figure shows an average, the blues show an average across species and shows you get quite a few responses at lower levels than the earlier curve had existed. And if you break them out into different species, you can see pilots and sperm whales have this pattern of response in red. Killer whales, there's a higher proportion responding at lower levels. But the empirical data suggests that you can pool pilot and sperm whales, but you might want to separate killer whales because they're more sensitive. That was not intuitive to us that a top predator would be more sensitive, but there's a lot of arguments among people who study predators that suggest that top predators have to be particularly sensitive to their environment to sort of beat out detection by their prey. Again, to bring this back to a UK topic, the issue of strandings of beaked whales, I think, is under pretty good control in places like SoCal and Tyack, but it is an active UK issue. And I'll just mention the report of strandings of more than 75 beaked whales off the west coast of Scotland in the summer of 2018. This is a broader range and a longer time period than the typical atypical pattern of stranding. Most of these animals were decomposed, and the data suggests that a drift analysis suggests that the event that occurred would have been in mid-July off Rockall Trough. Sonar signals were recorded by SAMS at this time. There was no record in the GNCC noise record, but when SAMS asked, when the Scottish Marine Animal Stranding Scheme asked the Royal Navy, they stated the Royal Navy were operational in that area at that time. We were unable to provide further detail of those operations as this could prejudice the defense of the UK. We don't know about the links here, but I think it just highlights the importance. There are ongoing strandings in European waters, and I think more attention needs to be paid on what we know about the risk factors for these animals and how to plan exercises in ways to protect them. And I don't know how realistic this is in the European setting, but I do think that it's quite clear that training ranges that were instrumented for passive acoustic monitoring to improve the training purposes. These were instrumented solely to improve the naval operations, but when they're adapted to detect beaked whales, I think they're clearly the best mitigation measure for sonar operations within tens of kilometers of beaked whale habitat, because the animals can respond over such great ranges. So an example of the Tyack range, the Score range off California, they can detect any beaked whale clicking on the range, but the hydrophones must be spaced 3 to 5 kilometers apart. This was done for tracking human objects. If you were going to select a location for operations and set up a range like this, it need not have as dense a set of sensors, but should be set up in order to help determine where animals are, because then that allows you to decide where to do an operation within the range, and you can also monitor responses in real time. It also appears the resident whales appear to learn to reduce dangerous responses to sonar. I showed you the animals moved off range before the sonar started. They seem to be old hands at this. They do have a reduced reproductive rate, but we have very little evidence for stranding.
Just to
Uh,
remind you, Peter, we have about 10 minutes left if you want to leave some time for questions as well.
yes, I'm just closing up. I did want to not just leave us with acute lethal responses, but to mention that I think that cumulative effects of multiple responses that are more minor than these lethal responses are just as important as rare lethal responses. So we have a growing number of stressors on marine ecosystems. There's a picture on the right that shows as humans have expanded into the ocean, we increased fishing, we increased chemical pollution. I've talked about noise pollution. In coastal waters, we have mechanical habitat destruction. We've introduced foreign species, and now climate change are all altering ecosystems. And all of these slowly have changes for populations that we need to develop new ways to deal with. And I worked with a National Academies panel that worked on how to bridge the gap between short-term responses and lifetime effects. And it came up with a conceptual framework that says we need to monitor the health of individuals within the population to integrate the effects of short-term responses and to link those to changes in survival and reproduction of individuals. And here's an example of population consequences of multiple stressors model. This is more of a conceptual model, but we've also been adapting these for specific case studies to actually be able to predict the links between exposure to stressors on the left, the dosage measured at the animal, the physiological or behavioral responses. There may be some immediate effects on survival and reproduction, like lethal stranding with exposure to sonar. But there are many cases where the physiological and behavioral responses may alter energy stores, endocrine status, immune status in ways that you could measure, and that those are the things that you link to survival and reproduction. And then you have to look at the impact of all across individuals to estimate the effect on population dynamics. And I'll just give an example from energy stores. So in this case of an animal detecting a threat, when an animal detects a human activity, it can assess the level of threat. It may increase its vigilance and cease foraging like the beaked whales do. It can trigger an anti-predator response like I described for this quiet surfacing. And even if the animals don't strand, it has energetic consequences. It will decrease the animal's intake for food. It may increase the metabolic rate. And if the pace of these is high enough, even that could reduce the survival or reproduction of an individual. And here's an example of a model showing the number of days a mother seal's foraging is disrupted as a function of pup survival. And you have a significant effect, even at lowish level, a few days of disruption on pup survival. So, and energy is really interesting because it provides a uniform currency for accumulating effects in terms of calories that you can measure in terms of lipid reserves in animals. So just to summarize, for managing cumulative effects on the broader scale, we need to think about what stressors can we reduce. Noise and fishing are two of the ones we can reduce. And unfortunately, things like climate change, chemical pollution, there are a lot of ones who are harming populations that we can't change. So that's going to put a bigger strain on the ones we can reduce. And we have to think about what time frames, and we have to be not have hubris. We have to be aware current science cannot predict when the cumulative effects of stressors risk harming a population or ecosystem. But we can identify populations and ecosystems that are at risk. When we do that, we need to think about what are the combinations of stressors whose reduction is most likely to prevent adverse consequences to the population or ecosystem. So I would advocate when we think about these problems, don't just think about noise. We need to think about when there's a problem, what combinations of stressors is most likely to help prevent the adverse consequences. With that, I'm happy to take on any questions.
All right. Thank you so much. That was super fascinating. We do have some questions in the chat, so I can read them out to you if that's helpful, or I think you might
Good,
have
that's great.
Okay. So the first one is, given what is known about impacts, are sonar exercises intentionally moved to minimize impact in a given region to help protect animals and their foraging in a particular area?
So I can't comment in the details. I can comment on the structure. Quite a few of the NATO navies, the U.S. has an external regulator, so they may have 5-year plans to work out training areas that are reviewed by the National Marine Fisheries Service to reduce impact. Most of the other NATO navies, the Ministry of Defense does an internal review, but most of them have a pre-operational review and may consider changing the location or the season of an operation based on these factors. And the UK Navy, the Dutch Navy, the Norwegian Navy have tactical decision aids on the ship, which will also assess current factors and help give sort of a red light, yellow light, green light decision mode about whether to transmit and what the likely impact will be.
Great, thank you. Another one we have is electric powered shipping and better propeller design enough to reduce the noise stressors to prevent adverse consequences, or will shipping still be too loud?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, the navies of the world have learned how to silence ships. It costs money and uh, it takes an amount of effort, but the International Maritime Organization has been looking closely at this. It takes, you know, ships take, there's a slow turnover time, but I think there is currently effort both just for ships to consider slowing down, which may reduce noise in some settings, and to modify the propulsion system and to improve propellers, both design and maintenance, in order to reduce the noise. I think it remains to be seen if in big port areas, if that will be enough to reduce adverse impacts. I've also worked on a project which, rather than adding noise, recognizes that there may be many areas in the world where noise is already so high you're at the impact plateau, and you have to reduce noise to look how things get better.
Okay, great. We have another one. Some of the strandings seem to be explained by the beaked whales surfacing too quickly and getting the bends. But in the controlled exposures, you showed the whales seemed to increase the duration of their dives. Could you please explain why this difference?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So most people have thought, most marine mammalogists initially thought that somehow marine mammals were immune to the bends. But no, you can't be immune to the laws of physics. On the other hand, these animals are breath hold divers. So it's not like they're breathing compressed gas at depth and then having explosive decompression from rapid surfacing. I don't think that rapid surfacing is as much of the problem. When they're deep, the lungs can completely collapse and you don't get gas exchange, but you may have a buildup of nitrogen in tissues in these animals as they're managing gases. The way I think of it is their response to an acute threat that they may interpret like an anti-predator threat may override their ability to manage these gases under pressure. And I actually think that longer time periods that are deep enough that you have a driving force for gas into tissue, but the lungs aren't fully collapsed, may be a bigger problem. Thank God, in none of our intentional experiments have we seen anything to injure the animals. On the other hand, that means we don't fully understand the behavior that causes the decompression syndrome. A brilliant Spanish veterinary pathologist has studied this in the Canaries and has shown gas emboli, the fat emboli. The gas emboli from explosive decompression don't last for that long, but fat emboli do. They're left over from the gas emboli. And he has shown fat emboli in some of these animals that died at sea and then washed up back on shore. So we're quite sure that there is a syndrome that in which beaked whale, there's something about the amazing dive behavior of these animals that is overridden by the sonar that causes an explosive decompression, but we don't know the details of how that happens.
All right, great. We have a couple more questions, so we'll try and answer a couple more before we run out of time. Have you found that continued sonar and artificial sound in a given region leads to permanent migration from the area? If so, how long does it typically take to cause such an impact?
So both Autech and the SoCal range have a lot of sonar operations and resident populations. The Autech range is the one where the populations have been most studied because you can identify individual animals, like on the picture here. You can see all the scratches on the animal. You can use those to identify individuals. There's a population on just about 70 kilometers away from Autech that seems to have higher calving rates than Autech. And it seems that the Autech is a pretty good foraging range, but the reproductive rate may be lower, and it actually may be a population sink where some animals come in from the outside, but you do not get complete abandonment.
Great. All right, and we'll take these last two, and then that'll probably it on time. So, one of them is, what is your view on the current level and appetite for research into effects of active sonar compared to previous years? Do you feel this area of impact still has the necessary interest and engagement?
I would say there's a bit of a split. The U.S. Maintains a strong research effort on this topic. I think that we have more need for an integration of research in the European setting, in the Mediterranean, and in the North Sea and the approaches to the UK from the eastern North Atlantic, both to study the species and to study responses. There is a major project that is run by the Norwegian Navy, particularly looking at impact on Norwegian seas. And I would say that has been very effective and very important, and maybe extrapolated a bit to other European waters. But I think there's an urgent, when you look at the current military situation, the Mediterranean is a very important area with a large number of beaked whales, an important anti-submarine warfare setting with not enough knowledge about effects and ways to reduce them.
All right, great. And then our other one, you mentioned that some animals have shifted their calls and frequency to move out of the shipping noise band. Do you think this is possibly an evolutionary effect driven by the lower frequency emitters failing to mate?
Oh, that's it. Yeah, I'm not sure about whether it's the success of if the animals are judging the success of their behavior. Humpback song, I've been talking about blue whales and fin whales. Humpbacks have higher frequency, much more complex songs that change year by year. And the dominant argument for why they change is that some males produce features of songs that some males sing with features that females like, and everybody else copies it. So I think if you go by analogy with that, it's completely reasonable to suggest that it may be driven by female choice and by success of the communication.
Great. All right, well, we are over time. There is one more quick one if you want to answer it. It is on if other marine animals other than whales are being assessed for audio impacts too.
Yes, I emphasized the beaked whales because it's such a striking, strong response. But I showed the examples of the killer whales, sperm whales, and pilot whales. Those are important for Norwegian waters and have been studied in detail there. Porpoises with piling have been studied in great detail in the North Sea. The key is to identify in the region you're going to be operating, what are the critical species, and devote studies on that. And there are quite a few global efforts trying to identify vulnerable and sensitive species and look at these impacts.
All right. Well, thank you. This talk has been super interesting, and the questions were great from the audience. Thank you for participating. Thank you, Peter, for being here for our special talk for the anniversary of the Institute of Acoustics. Yeah, this was great.
Sure, my pleasure.
All right. Well, we will see you all soon, hopefully, for some more webinars. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We'll be sharing the recording of the talk in the coming few days on our YouTube channel. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Peter.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.